All right, well, I think the protocol is to self-introduce. Is that correct? Yep. All right, so with that, I think it's pretty much 4 o'clock on the dot. And first of all, I want to welcome you all to, I think, what is the last session of the afternoon. I know there are competing slots with this session, so I'm very appreciative of all of you choosing this one. This is going to be the best out of the other sessions. And given it's the last session, I'm going to do my utmost to make this as interesting and enjoyable as possible. The topic that I'd like to share with you today is something that is very, very close to my heart, and that is with regards to not just project controls, but specifically project planning. And the presentation that I'd like to share with you is really a blend of a case study of a recent or early adopter of a new planning solution that we have developed. So I will share the story with you. So by means of introduction, first of all, my name is Dan Patterson. I'm the founder and CEO of a project analytics company called Basis. And really the Basis solution, as I mentioned, is the kind of the backdrop of discussion around the case study. So in the next 58 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is give you a very brief introduction to us as a solution. You know, that there's a lot of planning and project control solutions out there in the marketplace. So I'd like to talk a little bit as to why we saw a need for an evolved and what we believe to be an improved way of developing a project plan, and then share with you the case study. We've been working very closely with a large oil and gas owner organization in Houston, which is where we're headquartered. And they are experiencing a challenge, well, really multiple challenges, but part of it is brain drain and the ability to develop realistic and achievable plans. And then with that, I'd like to introduce how we worked with the client in question to solve that challenge. And they finished quickly. And then at the end, I'm not going to bore you with 60 minutes of PowerPoint. I'm probably going to do about 40 minutes of PowerPoint. And given it's the last session of the day, I'd like to give you a live hands-on demonstration of the solution, which it'll either go really well or it'll go really badly, at which point we're going to leave anyhow, so it doesn't matter. We're going to have a beer. It's going to go very, very well. So I've dedicated actually the whole of my professional career, just over 20 years now, to the science of project management. And I've been developing software tools that I know many of you still use today. And really the overarching objective of project controls, project planning, is to ensure successful project completion, whether that's on time and or on budget. And it's always been my belief that projects aren't late or over budget because of poor execution. They are perceived by us to be late and over budget because we are arguably not as strong at planning. We are overly optimistic, overly aggressive. And it's somewhat ironic that during the planning phase, we have multiple chances to get the plan right, whereas during execution, obviously in execution, we've got one shot at getting it right. And so everything that we've done in the last 2 decades has been geared towards improving planning. So in the late 1990s, we took the somewhat academic concept of risk analysis in Monte Carlo and developed the PERTmaster solution, which is now part of the Primavera Oracle solution known as PRA. And I think really the massive benefit that occurred there was people started to think in terms of what we call risk-adjusted scheduling. I still think of a CPM schedule as it's the best case scenario, and it's the best case scenario because we're not inherently taking into account the potential risks and uncertainty and also opportunities that go into reality when we get to execution. Now, that was all very well, and it definitely improved the science of planning. It was very, very vulnerable, though, to the underlying integrity of the schedule. So for those of you that are planners, schedulers, using CPM tools, you'll know that you can make a CPM schedule say whatever the heck you want it to say by either using constraints or just cutting a piece of logic. CPM schedules are very, very prone to the building blocks that we use to build those schedules. And so we took a step back, and that's when we introduced the concept of schedule analytics, the likes of Acumen Fuse, which is really a checks and balances tool. Now, I guess fast forward, accelerate 20 years down the road, what I've come to realize now is it's all very well helping the industry by developing tools that are sort of retrospective or reactive. So again, with your risk model, you build a schedule, then you do your risk analysis. We're doing schedule critique and schedule analytics. You build your tool, and then you run your checks and balances. Well, I think in 2017, we're at the point now where we shouldn't fire up a CPM tool and get, what happens when you fire up Microsoft Project or Primavera and you do file new? You get a blank screen, you get a blank sheet of paper. Well, that's ridiculous. We should be at the point today where we should be able to benefit from our previous experience, our previous projects, as-builts, corporate standards. And so really that was the driver and the catalyst for us developing what we call the basis solution. So the solution is really threefold. It's active benchmarking, planning guidance, and capturing team expertise as well. So the active benchmarking, the reason why we prefix benchmarking with active there is that as you are building a plan in basis, it actually gives you suggestions as to what the duration should be, what the cost should be, how many man hours should you allocate to the activity. Not only that, it also gives you insight into have you missed specific logic links. So it's not just doing a logic check and saying, oh, you've got missing predecessors and missing successors. If you're working on procurement scope within basis, it's smart enough to come back and say, well, actually, based on the type of procurement scope you're building, typically we would have these predecessors leading from perhaps detailed design or feed engineering. So it has context and knowledge about what you're building. Now, we think that's a massive step forward. And today you can't pick up a newspaper without reading something about AI or artificial intelligence. To an extent, I think AI is somewhat of it's a bit of a marketeering hype. I don't believe that we can develop a tool that's going to replace the experience and expertise of a planner. What I do believe is that if we can capture the knowledge and expertise of planners during the planning process, if that can be captured and then stored in an effective manner, then there's no reason why we can't start to augment the planning process when new projects come online and we start to build out additional plans. So that's partly where the team expertise component comes into play. So within the solution, there is the concept of me as the lead planner. I may build my top-down plan, maybe engineering, procurement, construction, but then I hand over the responsibility of detailing out the very detailed plan for construction. I may delegate that down to, say, Niall, and then, Niall, you can flesh out your plan, and in turn, you can sub-delegate down to your broader team. So we're starting to introduce the concept of what we call consensus-based planning. So that's really the main focus and really the main components within the solution. So we've been working with a very large oil and gas owner organization in the north of Houston for several months in conjunction with developing the software. And the organization in question historically has worked on very, very large CapEx projects, typically around the $5 billion mark. Well, with the recent market softening, they're changing their economic profile and saying, well, instead of working on a very small number of $5 billion projects, we're going to go back to smaller projects, still very large, order of magnitude $250 to $500 million, but a much higher quantity of projects. And some of the projects involve, for example, tiebacks to existing facilities or installations that they already have as assets. So with that, they're seeing more repetition, albeit the projects are very unique. So they have a much larger volume of planning, and they're struggling with really a combination of the volume of planning, but also the fact that the experienced planners, the team members that understand how to build these assets, these facilities, they are very often retiring. And so that was really the challenge of the organization. I think the key here is that the organization identified benchmarking. They said, okay, well, if we can start to capture historical as-builts, and if we can come up with standards for even something as simple as WBS dictionaries, if we can just have standard templates that our projects can inherit from, that has to be a massive step forward. And in addition, they were experiencing, I guess, lack of team member validation. And you know, the number of risk workshops that I've been a participant in where you put the schedule on the screen and it ends up being a schedule review, not a risk workshop, because people are arguing about the durations and the sequence. Well, this is a massive, massive problem. So why not involve the project team members, the experts, during the planning process? It's not fair that we can expect a very savvy scheduler or planner, someone that can drive a very heavyweight scheduling tool. That's one thing. But being able to understand how to put together a 5,000 activity schedule on a $5 billion project, there's more than one person involved in that development of a plan. And that was the challenge that they faced. So going back to benchmarking. So benchmarking obviously is not by any means a new concept. Benchmarking is essentially comparing what you're doing to some other lookup or standard. The problem we have with benchmarking in CPM scheduling is that, of course, the CPM schedule is hierarchical, and you can break down a 2-year construction activity or summary into thousands and thousands of sub-activities all the way down to one-day activities. So it's almost impossible to know where to benchmark against because schedules are just, they're iterative in their breakdown of detail. And so schedule benchmarking, I think, is an area in project planning that we really haven't successfully addressed so far until today. So we've taken a step back and said, well, okay, we know there's a need for benchmarking, but it hasn't been effective by trying to benchmark activities. So we've come up with a concept whereby we actually don't even get involved in CPM scheduling at the beginning. We actually call this pre-planning. And we say, okay, before you get into the weeds and you start building out activities and logic and calendars and constraints, that's the how, that's the work, right? That's what activities or tasks are in the schedule. It's not the what, it's not the scope that you're building. So we're saying, well, wouldn't it be better if, first of all, we start with planning packages. So planning packages, think of planning packages as your deliverables. It's your scope of work. What is it we're trying to build during this project? We'll worry about how to build it. That's the work. That's the schedule. That's the sequence, the activity, so on and so forth. So again, I think CPM tools today are very, very work-focused, and we haven't done a good job as an industry in saying, well, first of all, let's define timelines for our deliverables. So those timelines are what we call planning packages. And then as we start to add activities and detail to the schedule, those planning packages become what we call work packages. Now you might be thinking, well, okay, it's just a summary activity with a different name. Well, it is and it isn't, and it's more that it isn't, because if you think of a CPM planning or scheduling tool, if you have a summary activity with 2 child activities in sequence, and both the durations double over children, the WBS summary doubles now. The WBS grows and shrinks to encapsulate the children, right? Well, that's backwards, because if we're saying, well, our deliverable should take 6 months, the work shouldn't drive the duration of the deliverable. What we should be saying is, well, the deliverable is expected to take 6 months. The work that we've identified to achieve that deliverable is going to take maybe 8 months. Well, there's a disconnect, there's a bust. Don't let the deliverable automatically grow and shrink just because of the work that's within it. So that's why we're separating planning packages and activities and work packages. Now, against each planning package, we then associate a deliverable. And this is a really key aspect because the deliverables also define or carry a quantity. So now we don't just have a WBS structure, but we have a WBS structure or a planning package structure that identifies our deliverables, and then we have quantities against those deliverables. And it's the deliverables that we then use for the benchmarking, because it's a lot easier to have standards and benchmarks against, well, how long does it take to drill 10 wells, or how long does it take to lay a foundation slab of a certain square footage. So having benchmarks on deliverables is much more straightforward and achievable than trying to do benchmarking against activities, as I mentioned earlier, because you can break down activities just infinitely down to smaller and smaller packages. So that's how we achieve the hook, if you like, when doing the benchmarking. Again, when you benchmark, you look at what you're doing and you compare it to something else. And what we're doing here is saying, well, if we have planning packages that carry deliverables, it should be then fairly straightforward to do the lookup. Now, the challenge with the lookup is that in my particular project, I may have a scope of work called engineering, and yet in my database or knowledge library, I may have something that says design or DES with a full stop or a period. You have to be very, very pure and diligent in order to have your breakdown structure and then be able to match that up to your knowledge or your database. Well, we've come up with an artificial intelligence technique which it does a smart match, if you like. So Basis is smart enough such that if I'm working on engineering scope and yet the analogous scope in the knowledge library is called design, it knows it's the same type of scope. And it does things like it looks at predecessors and successors, so it understands where the work sits in the schedule. It understands the duration, so it understands context. Well, that's hugely powerful because now we have the freedom of building our plan, but yet the tool is guiding us and it has a smart match. And the really clever thing about it is if it gets the match wrong, it will come back and make a suggestion, and you as the lead planner can say, well, actually, no. You've given me the wrong piece of information, and you can tell it to go back and try again, or you can point it in the right direction. It learns the more you use it. So that's where we touch on what we call the augmented intelligence. It's not artificial intelligence. I don't believe from a technology standpoint we're there as an industry, and I don't believe from a planning perspective we should even try and make that leap. So for benchmarking things like duration, what we're able to do now, based on the fact that, in this example here, I'm focusing on engineering, and I've defined, in the previous screen here, I defined that I have 10 drawings as my deliverable for engineering. This is what I need to produce for the engineering scope. Basis has come back and said, okay, I found previous projects or standards in the knowledge library that are also related to the development of engineering or design drawings. Now, one of the challenges, again, is in my project, I'm being tasked with delivering 10 drawings. Well, the previous projects have different quantities. So Basis will actually normalize the durations based on the quantity to give you an equivalency. Okay? So we end up with rates. And it's these rates that I can then look at and say, well, okay, on average, historically, my organization has taken just under 5 days to deliver an engineering drawing. Right now, I've scheduled 7 days per drawing. So I get the choice, and I can say, okay, well, actually, I want to take into account the organization's benchmark for how long it takes me to develop an engineering drawing. Now, graphically, we also show that through what we call waypoints, so the little orange markers here. And again, this is all real time. You don't build a plan and then throw this thing into Basis. As you're building the plan, these little waypoints show up, and it's taking into account the deliverable, the quantity, it's going and doing a lookup into the knowledge library, and it's coming back and making a suggestion. So it's guidance during the planning process rather than proactively or rather after the effect running some form of analysis. Does that make sense? Okay. So when we rolled out the solution to the client in question, they were obviously very, very interested in the schedule benchmarking, and we also provide the ability to do the exact same thing with regards to cost. What they said to us was, well, actually, we're more interested in the required man hours than we are cost at this point, because what we like to do is we like to look at the man hours and then go back and figure out how many resources to satisfy that scope of work. So the benchmarking is applicable to duration, cost, and man hours as well. Now, with regards to cost, there's an extra little twist, I guess, to the story here, because we're very strongly advocating that you start with a top-down plan. You build your deliverables, your scope, then you come back and do your bottom-up, fleshing out the schedule with activities and logic and so on and so forth. Well, the same thing applies to cost. If you start with a top-down cost estimate, so again, I may have my drawing scope, 15 drawings to deliver. I can see that I've estimated it's going to cost me $13,500. My benchmark within my knowledge library is 15,000, so I'm coming in slightly cheaper than my standard rate for my organization. But more interestingly, my delegated either planners or cost estimators have started to detail out drawings. We've got electrical drawings, structural drawings. They also have put in quantities. They've also been validated by the knowledge library. Their bottoms-up estimate of $15,000 obviously doesn't match my top-down 13.5. So within the tool, I as the lead planner can then make a decision. I can say, well, do I want my cost estimate now to be bottom-up driven, or do I want my top-down to actually flow down and adjust these rates? So again, it's a very, very good calibration approach, because if you start with your top-down, whether it's duration and or cost, that's effectively that's your target. And then you build the detail, and the detail says, okay, well, this is what we can achieve, and then you compare the two. Okay, so that's the cost benchmarking component of what the client implemented. Any questions so far?
I presume a number of functions are interfacing with the tool and contributing to the decisions and the refinements that the tool prompts?
So yes, I think if I understand your question correctly, you're asking multiple functions or potentially more than one team member working and contributing to the same area of scope. Very much so. So we call this delegated planning, and there's two levels of delegated planning. So one is, let me go back, let's find a, well, now you put my slide deck out of whack now, but for delegated planning, I can delegate, for example, construction scope to you. You have free reign as to building activities, logic, the very detailed planning. That's different to what we call markup delegation. Markup is saying, okay, I've established my plan or my cost estimate, and I don't want you to start adding additional scope elements. I simply want you to collaborate and give me your expert opinion on, have I got the quantities right? Have I identified the right deliverables? Have I got the right cost? So yes, there's two forms of contribution. There's delegated planning, and then markup, which is once you've built it, gain those contributions. And then I'll show you towards the end, we do an analysis, we call it consensus-based or consensus-driven planning. So the idea is the more people that can give you input on your plan, you can then review all of those inputs down to a common consensus. The tool is even smart enough to look at the variation in consensus, because if you have, if you're looking at a scope of work and there's a very tight consensus, a high degree of similarity, that's a good thing. If your consensus comes back but there's a very high spread, then you really want to throw it back to your project team members and say, no, I'm not willing to accept this until we get a higher degree of agreement on the estimate. Okay, benchmarking through subnets. This bit's really exciting. So, well, the other bit was pretty exciting, right? So in addition to being able to validate durations, costs, and man hours, we can also take advantage of benchmarking through the development of subnets. So what this means is, rather than, again, me as the planner having to manually create my schedule and build activities and milestones and logic links, I can go off and query the knowledge library, and the knowledge library will come back with subnets of schedule or scope from the library, and I then get to choose and look at those and say, yes, that's relevant, and it will automatically embed them within my schedule. And again, one of the clever aspects of this is if I'm working on a pipeline project and my scope of work is 20 kilometers, Basis goes off and does its magic. It comes back and says, hey, Dan, I found some previous projects where there was pipeline construction. It's smart enough to say, oh, but in the previous project, it was 50 kilometers scope. So I'm going to give you the activities and the sequence, but I'm recommending that we alter the durations. So it will automatically calibrate, again, durations, costs, and man hours based on your scope of work. So the client in question, what they did, they took the last, or they're still developing the library, but they took the last 10 years worth of Primavera schedules that they've used for both planning, execution, and closeout. They fed them all into the knowledge library, and now they're going in the other direction because they're now building new plans, and as they build plans, they're simply just calling upon the knowledge library, and it's coming back not just with the durations and cost rates and man hours. They're able to leverage the subnets from previous projects. And they're taking that a step further. It's not just as-built that you can feed into the knowledge library. You can also build up your own organizational standards, again, whether it's something as simple as a WBS dictionary, or it can even be, for those of you that are using risk registers, rather than starting from scratch each time you develop a risk model, you know, there are common types of risk based on project type. And so having risk register templates in the library is very, very powerful as well. So it's really a combination of schedule, cost, resources, and risk information that you can store in the knowledge library. Okay. Any comments, questions?
Yeah, just a quick one on that.
Sure.
So the base case or the
example that you've given, this first user, if they're an organisation that's got 10 years worth of P6 plans, does Basis come with a sort of inbuilt sort of knowledge bank for organisations that don't have that backlog, that maybe haven't perhaps kept the best records or don't have the experience there?
So your question is, do we, as part of the solution, provide some of those templates and standards in the knowledge library? Our contribution is quite humble. We do have risk register templates based on project type. We do have WBS dictionaries. We're not at the point yet where we have libraries of detailed schedules. What we're thinking is it would actually be more valuable to you as an audience not to have templates from us, but us to partner with organizations that provide standard benchmarking. So for example, in the US, there's an organization called IPA, very predominant in oil and gas projects. They have 30 years worth of benchmarking data. Well, wouldn't it be more useful if you could actually use that data in the Basis solution? So that's what we're thinking with regards to knowledge outside of the organization that's using the tool. Okay, so everything I've talked about so far has very much been computer and technology heavy. There's also a very strong and important human aspect to it as well. So in addition to the knowledge library, which guides us through and makes suggestions, we also encourage and allow, as we mentioned before, team members to contribute, either to build up the plan or to mark up the existing plan. So it's really a combination of human benchmarking and the AI component. And I'll show you an example in a few minutes in the product where I'll play the role of a lead planner, or we'll play the role of a lead planner. We'll build a high-level schedule, and then we'll ask some team members to come along and contribute. And then we will review it almost as if we're doing an interactive planning session. So again, we're not suggesting a piece of software can replace something like an interactive planning session. It's actually helping facilitate, because getting everyone in the room and seeing that, Chris said it was 64 days, Melissa said it was 136 days, that's a massive difference, big deltas. So being able to understand the consensus and talk it through in those interactive planning sessions is very, very important. Team members can also raise issues, risks, action items, make suggestions for adding additional activities and logic, so on and so forth as well. So where does all of this information reside? Well, we've touched somewhat on the fact that the information resides in what we call the knowledge library. And I think one point to note about the knowledge library is that you can have what we call knowledge chapters. So you can group organizational knowledge, whether it's by a business unit, by geographical location, type of project. And the reason why we do that is if you're an organization that works on varied or different types of project, if I'm building an offshore platform, I don't want Basis coming back and trying to give me suggestions for a onshore pipeline or a commercial office building or a hospital. Okay, so you can group knowledge into knowledge chapters. And again, knowledge can be as high level as a WBS dictionary. This is your standard outlines that you would use to start building out your project. Historical as-built, either from Primavera or Microsoft Project. Standards, so this is more aligned to things like rates of work, costing, and I mentioned also the risk register templates as well, and continuous calibration. So once you've got the knowledge in the tool and your planners, your team members, your contributors are all starting to subscribe to the knowledge, as I mentioned, they get the opportunity to push back and say, actually, basis, no, you're suggesting it's 120 days, you're wrong. It's 150 days based on current market conditions. Well, every time a team member makes a contribution, basis actually takes that contribution and stores it in the knowledge library as an overlay to what it already has, and it goes into a pending or a non-validated layer, so that there is, you still have control over the knowledge library. So your team members can't just completely blow away your organizational standards. There's a review process by which that suggested pushback goes through before it becomes accepted knowledge. Okay, so with that, I promised I wouldn't spend all my time on PowerPoint. Quick time check. Phil, what time have we got? 4:32. So 28 minutes to beer time. So, okay, let's show you how this organization is using the tool. So, okay, so I'm logged into Basis as a lead planner. This is a very simple dashboard. It's just showing me existing projects that I'm either the owner of or a contributor to. So rather than working with an existing project, let's create a project completely from scratch. So we'll go ahead and add a new project, and I'm not very creative. I'm going to call this London Expo project. Someone's taken a photograph of the new project window there. All right, and I'm going to estimate that this project's going to take me a year, and let's just say it's a relatively small project. We'll call it $1 million. Oh. Okay. All right, so this is a web-based application. So at this point, I'm presented with a single timeline, which is my year-long project. And again, we're going to start by doing a top-down plan focusing very much on deliverables. So I could make life hard for myself and say, okay, well, I could click on the planning package icon here and manually create these planning packages. But I actually want to take advantage of some of the accelerator capabilities within the product. So I'm going to say, okay, for my project, I'm going to go down to the smart planning capability, and I just want to outline 3 planning packages that represent my engineering, procurement, construction areas of scope. So I'm going to go ahead and create 3, and I can choose to use logic or not with planning packages. So, okay, so Basis has just gone ahead and created those 3 planning packages, and if I choose again, I could start to vary the duration. I can change the logic links, I can add additional planning packages, so on and so forth. I think more importantly, let's go ahead and take this first element, and I'm just going to call this engineering. And now we get into the definition of deliverables. So I'm working on my engineering scope here, and again, I'm going to say, well, part of my delivery here is to deliver perhaps P&IDs or drawings. So I'm simply going to type drawings, and let's put in a quantity. Let's call it 12. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that. And you'll notice now, as I put in the quantity and the deliverable type, Basis has come back with the little orange waypoint. So it knows now that I'm dealing with engineering scope. It knows that I'm dealing with engineering drawings or P&IDs, and it also knows the quantity. So what it's done, it's gone and looked up in the knowledge library, and it's come back and said, actually, on average, based on the knowledge chapters that we're subscribing to, my duration is, I've overestimated my duration. Okay, in fact, I've overestimated it by several days, and I can actually drill down and see that in 2016, the rate here was actually much more aggressive than I have today. In fact, it's taking me 7 days per drawing. In 2016, on a Gulf of Mexico project here, I was able to actually knock out a drawing in just over 2 days. It gets slightly worse over time. So these are previous projects or standards here that I can start to do my benchmark or comparison again. So at this point, I get a choice. I can say, well, I want to go with the most recent, or perhaps, it's only over a 3-year period. I want to take the average. So if I take the average, then what Basis will do is it'll recalibrate my planning package based on the information in the knowledge library. Okay? So now I'm starting to get some validation. I know how long that scope of work is based on the fact I've tied it back to our historical performance. So that's a very simple example of doing the duration benchmarking. I could do exactly the same thing for cost. So based on my quantity, I can look through and look at previous projects here. Again, I'm going to go ahead and take the consensus or the average. And additionally, let's go down to our procurement scope now. So with regards to procurement, again, I have a choice. I can manually start to detail out my deliverables, or I can say, actually, I know very little about procurement. I want to see whether there are previous projects or information in the knowledge library that will help guide me through the development of my procurement scope. So I'm going to go down to smart planning again, but this time go to the knowledge library, and I'm just going to simply type in procurement, and I'm now presented with knowledge chapters that pertain to procurement. So again, I can drill down, I can interrogate, I can try and find what I think is the right scope of work, and I can add that to my project. And Basis will pull from the knowledge library and include it now within my top-down plan. And again, I can subsequently say, well, actually, my valve quantity here of 20 on this particular project, I'm not dealing with 20 valves. I'm dealing with perhaps 8 valves. And again, it says, okay, well, do you want me to go ahead and recalibrate the duration and the cost as well? So I could say yes, and it'll go ahead and update accordingly. All right, and I can do exactly the same thing for cost as well. So this is showing me cost information based on the deliverables and comparing it back to my benchmarking. Okay? So again, we're building a top-down plan. It's all about deliverables at this point. We haven't started to get into the CPM scheduling part with activities and precedence logic or anything like that. We're purely building a deliverable-based plan. So let's close off on our top-down planning. For construction, I'm going to do nothing more than just call this, say, pipeline, and we'll call this construction. Okay, so now we've done our top-down plan. We need to change modes and start thinking about, well, what is the work we need to do to execute and deliver these deliverables? So in the build plan view, this is now where we can take our engineering, procurement, construction scope, and again, I can either work in a highly automated manner or I can work in a very manual environment. So if I want to manually develop activities, I can create, for example, in engineering, I can go ahead and build out my activities. I can link them together. Nothing too exciting here. I'm building a CPM schedule. What is interesting, though, is you see the orange target mark there. I originally set a target or a basis date based on how long I thought it would take me to achieve my 12 drawings. Well, by me sequencing these activities and putting in durations, I've blown through that basis date or that target date. So again, it's a really good indicator of saying, well, actually, okay, you're starting to flesh out the plan, but it's out of alignment already with your top-down estimate. So we're constantly trying to marry up our top-down deliverable-based plan with the work that we need to achieve that plan. So in the interest of time, let's go down to construction. And again, I could manually build out my activities, or I can say, well, I want to interrogate the knowledge library. I know that we've worked on previous pipeline construction projects before. So back in smart planning under library, Basis is even smart enough. Look, I didn't even have to type a search or anything in. It knows that this element pertains to pipeline construction. And in the bottom right, it's already coming back with suggestions. So I can drill down, perhaps let's go into 2016. And in here, I can see the various activities for my pipeline construction scope. So you can say, okay, I think this is what I'm interested in. And you'll notice here in the knowledge library, it's found pipeline construction, but it's for, in this case, a quantity of 50. Well, in our project, again, if our scope is not 50, but perhaps 25, I even get the choice of saying, well, I want to use this chunk of knowledge, but as part of doing the import of the subnet, I want you to recalibrate the durations based on a difference in quantity. So it's more than just pulling in subnets. Now, when we go ahead and add this subnet, Basis will add it to our project. And let me just sort the dates here. Okay, so these yellow markers are what we call tie-ins. One of the challenges when you pull in a subnet is it's very rare for a subnet not to have logic, external logic coming into it and going out of it. You know, schedules are very, very interwoven. So what it's done is it's pulled in the subnet and it's remembered the tie-in points. So in here we have tie-ins for long leads. So what it's saying is this, in the knowledge library, this point here, or this activity here, was dependent on procuring long lead items, which is up in procurement. So what it's telling me is you're not quite finished yet. You need to tie off, these tie-in points to ensure that you have a valid and complete schedule. So again, it's as simple as taking our predecessors. So I could create procurement activities in here. I could just tie it to engineering, but let's take our long leads. I don't have any activities here. There's my tree scope. So I'm going to create an activity for procurement for my tree. And I'm simply going to tie that now to the tie-in for my long leads. And you'll notice now the plan got time analyzed. So it's doing CPM on the fly, so it's constantly updating. Okay. So I'm at the point now where I've built out my deliverables. I've started to detail out the schedule. I now want to hand it over to some of my other team members, either for more detailed planning or for the markup process. So in order to do that, I need to very quickly add some team members. So we'll go to project configuration, contributors, and let's very quickly add Paul, Melissa, and Chris, and we'll make them all contributors. Okay, so back in our plan now, I could, for example, say, okay, for procurement, I would like to delegate the planning responsibility down to, say, Melissa, but yet for construction, I'm pretty happy with the construction schedule that I've put together. I don't want any other team members messing with my schedule. I want them to contribute and give me feedback as to whether or not I've built a realistic plan. So I'm going to ask now for the construction scope, I'm going to ask Chris, Paul, and Melissa to all give their feedback. So far, so good? Okay, and the final piece of work that I have to do is say, okay, now that I've invited those team members, they all receive an email, and I have to say to them, okay, please review, and I have to start the review cycle. So I have control as the lead planner as to periods of time as to when team members can actively give their contribution. And I can also do things like rolling wave, which limits them to, for example, 4-week look-aheads, things like that. So let's go ahead now and start the review cycle. And it's asking me here, okay, we're about to go through a phase where we're going to have lots of additional contributions. Do you want me to take a baseline or a snapshot so I can compare? So I'm going to go ahead and say yes. And at this point, the review cycle is now on. So I can now switch roles and play Melissa. We assigned 3 team members. We did Melissa, Chris, and Paul. So because this is the collaborative part of the presentation, I'm actually going to very quickly phone Paul and say, you have some homework to do. Now, Paul's sitting in Houston, so again, this is where the presentation may go horribly wrong. So.
Hello.
Paul, it's Dan.
Hey, Dan.
So, as you know, I'm in London. we're in the middle of the presentation, and we're demonstrating markup. So I'd like you to, well, did you get your email, by the way?
I did. I got my email that said I was added to the London Expo project.
Okay, so can you do your homework, please?
I will do my homework. Consider it done.
Okay, I hope all's well in Houston.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. Cheers.
Bye.
Okay, so Paul now is looking, or hopefully looking at the construction scope of the schedule, and he's now giving his contribution. So let me show you what Paul's doing by playing the role of the second contributor, Melissa. So Melissa now also can see the London Expo project. And when she drills down into, her markup view, okay. Basis is saying, Melissa, you have 10 items to review, and they all relate to the construction scope. This is the scope that we detailed out earlier. So Melissa can look at this and say, okay, pipe installation, it's 120 days. That seems somewhat aggressive to me. I'm going to go ahead and increase the duration by 20 days. Not only that, I'm going to go ahead and say risk of lower productivity. So Melissa is not only contributing to the plan, she's also raising, in this case, a risk. She can even put a probability and a score on the risk as well. Now, if we go down to, say, the facility scope, the 90 days, she may be very comfortable with the duration, but not so comfortable with the start date, the ability to start on a particular date. So she can say, I'm okay with the duration, but it needs to start later. Conversely, for train 2, perhaps she's okay with it. Now, rather than going activity by activity, I'm showing you an example where she's been asked to give feedback on 10 elements. Well, in the real world, she may be asked to give feedback on 100 elements. Yes, she can go one by one, or she can go up to the WBS or the work package level, and for here we've got infield construction. For the whole of infield, she can look at this and either accept or push back as a scope of work rather than an individual activity. So let's just go ahead and accept that. You see in the top right, you can see her not only her progress, you can see how many activities she's pushed back on versus bought into. Okay, so now let's go back as Dan, the lead planner. And what I'm able to see now is that I invited Melissa, Paul, and Chris, and I can see that Paul actually completed everything we asked of him. Melissa only completed 6 out of the 10 assignments. Chris is still working on his, but that's okay. And what I can do now is go into what we call the consolidate view. So it's pulling the data from the server, it's returned, it's saying there have been 10 markup items. And if I go down to now, let's see, piping installation. So I estimated the duration to be 120 days, which is over there. And Paul has said, no, it's 103. Melissa said 144. Chris is okay with it at 120. So I get a choice now as the lead planner. I can say, well, do I take one of these individuals' contribution and run with it? Or, if I've delegated down and the thinking is, well, I trust and believe what those delegates are going to tell me, I can take the consensus of 122 and that will get applied back to my underlying basis layer, my schedule. So I can say, yep, I'm okay with 122 days. And there was our risk that we identified. Melissa identified the risk. I want to pull that into my risk register. And let's go ahead and commit that to the plan. So let's go down now to the facility. So we can see here, everybody actually pushed back. So my estimate of 90 days, Chris said 72. Paul said he's okay with the duration, but not okay with the date. So Chris is one of our engineers in Austin. We had a booth incident. We lost our booth for the conference. And so it was a very sore subject. So he's actually trying to be funny. He's saying ship the booth earlier. So, idiot. So I can look at the durations here. And again, I can choose either individual contribution, or I can take the consensus, or I can consult the knowledge library. So I'll go ahead and take the consensus on the duration and the date. And they also raised issues and risks, so I'm going to grab those as well. So I can, in the same way that a team member can go one by one or do a batch update, I can do the same thing. So if I'm comfortable with the input that's coming in from my team, I can go all the way to, for example, I can go all the way to the top of construction, and I can say, okay, I want to take the input from a certain individual, or I want to take the consensus. Okay. So what I can see now is my original plan is starting to shift significantly to the right. This is our original snapshot or baseline, but I've consulted the knowledge library in building my plan. I then put that out to my team members for review and discussion. So what I'm ending up with is a plan that I now feel much more confident in because I've got the input and the validation of my team members, but I still have had input in deciding whose input goes into the final plan. So yeah, so we were talking about, I still have control, but I have the validation from my team members, and also I built my original plan, not just in isolation thinking, this is what I think. I was using the knowledge library to build my original basis. So that's the thinking and sort of the gist of the tool. Like I say, it was some of the concepts, especially the markup component, was developed very closely with the organization in question. I actually wanted them to be here today. What they're doing is they're in the early phases of rolling this out across 50 projects. So in 2018, they're actually going to plan 50 projects using Basis. So what they said was, well, in a year's time, they'll come back and stand with me at the podium and do an in-person case study. But so that's really where we're at with the solution. So another area that we're working on and soon to be released before Christmas is I demonstrated benchmarking durations and man hours and cost and pulling in subnets and things like the markup. We're also now taking the concept of markup down to the activity level. And what that's allowing us to do is we're now able to sequence logic and logic or sequence of activities. So, I'm working on engineering drawings, and from that, Basis is now smart enough to say, okay, Dan, that's great, but you've missed some feasibility work that typically goes on as a precursor to doing your engineering drawings. Likewise, you've missed a scope of work. You've got the wrong logic on a successor. So this is looking now at both sequence, but also completeness of schedule. Well, that's pretty smart because this isn't now just a tool for validating what I've put into the plan. It's actually helping and guiding me and reminding me of things that I've missed. So it's all leading towards, it's leading towards completeness of planning. So we're very close to launching that update. So the inclusion of logic and sequence benchmarking. See, I'm under. So for us, this is a very, very exciting time. I think, like I said in the introduction, we've historically focused on tools that have helped you after you've built a plan, whether it's doing a risk analysis or the structural integrity. And I think, for me, why this is so exciting is we're actually taking a step. This is pre-planning, right? It's guiding you through the very early planning process. You can still do your detailed planning and execution in your CPM scheduling tool of choice if you choose to afterwards, but use Basis as the starting point to get your structure correct, to get the correct risks identified, to get the sequence correct, and to get the top-down durations, costs, and man hours accurate as well. And talking of risk, I didn't mention this, but in the tool, and the same applies to schedule as well, but obviously we have bidirectional import-export with the likes of Microsoft Project and Primavera. With regards to risk, if you're using PRA or Acumen Risk or Barbacana, we actually export the risk information out of Basis into your risk tool as well. So again, it's, you know, I've spent many years evangelizing the value of risk analysis. I think I've come to the conclusion it's still very powerful, but it's kind of silly that we do it separate to planning and scheduling. It should be done part and parcel of our planning, which is why in the tool, team members can identify risks and issues and action items. So, so that's where we're at. So I know it's 5 o'clock. I'm very happy to take any questions. I hope this was enjoyable, and if there's no questions, I'm going to go for a beer.
Just quickly to see how you can record progress on and reporting.
Sure. So right now we are very, very heavy, obviously, on pre-planning and planning. The progress capabilities right now in the market review process, if I enable the ability for a team member to progress, it's simply progressing the bar. We're extending it, but for now, we wanted to do pre-planning and planning very, very well, and then, but you can just drag the bar. Drag the progress bar on the bar. Yeah. Question?
Yes, it looks to me like in certain industries that would be essential as the projects are repetitive and the same or sort of a similar method of approaching the projects. The bespoke ones, it will be used in some sort of stages of the project life cycle. How about integration with already the tools that exist and we work with? Is it flexible enough, the technology has been based on the language being written with, that it could be integrated with Oracle easily? I could export and import from Excel and it saved my time.
Okay, so, well, of course I'm going to say yes, but let me give you the proper answer. So within, for example, my plan, this is actually, I think, very, very powerful. Rather than just saying I want to export the whole schedule into Oracle Primavera, I can actually go down to any element. So let's say I'm comfortable with our construction scope now. We've done the markup, consolidation, the consensus, but I'm not yet comfortable with procurement because I'm still waiting on Melissa to build out procurement. I can go down to specifically construction, and I can publish construction out to XER, Excel, project, or generic XML. Or I can go up to the project as a whole and take the whole project and export. With regards to your broader question with tools outside of perhaps the scheduling realm and Oracle specifically, the product's actually built on what we call web services. So without getting too technical, the client just subscribes to a server engine through web services. And we've architected it that way such that if you choose to either push or pull information to and from the tool, then there's already a built-in API interface in the product, because we use the same API to drive the software.
I'm fascinated to know what the softer side of life in terms of it's very hard for us to embed controls and innovation and new tools into organizations. And I'm fascinated to hear what the reaction has been and where the hurdles are and how we've overcome it.
So when we wrote Acumen and launched Fuse, people hated it. And it's because we came to market and said, well, here's a tool and it's going to police your schedule. You push the Fuse button and it comes back and tells you you've got a bad schedule. The reaction to this tool has been very, very different. And I think what it is it's the markup process. People know that by gaining team member input, they know that's a valuable thing, but it's very painful to do today. You try and do it through email, post-it notes, you sit through a tedious schedule review, but there isn't a vehicle for making that very effective. So people are very excited about the markup process. I think certainly in certain industries, specifically oil and gas, because there's such a bad brain drain of qualified planners, the knowledge library is also resonating a lot. I think the only concern or question that we are getting consistently is, can you basis help us get the knowledge into the knowledge library? And there is some implementation overhead associated with that. I mean, it can be as simple as taking 20 XER files and just loading them into the knowledge library. But there's some cleansing of the data involved in that too. So it's, like any useful tool, it's not just a magic, push the button and here's your knowledge library. There is some, you've got to be able to take that knowledge and put it into the tool. But we believe we've made it very easy through the likes of the knowledge chapters. So I didn't show you the knowledge library, but in here, I have verified, unverified, and then within here I've got things like WBS dictionaries, benchmarks. And I like to come in here and create additional chapters that pertain to certain types of project or certain size of project, things like that.
Hi there, sorry. I think it's a great tool applied to scheduling, to be perfectly honest with you. But I like the bit that when you went for markup, someone could add a risk. Does the tool, or do you have plans for the tool to use the same process for risk as well and benchmark risks per activity? So, you know, your 3-point estimates and stuff like that and probabilities.
I thought you were going to ask if we're going to do another Monte Carlo tool, because we're not. But the next step is to absolutely benchmark uncertainties. Yes. Yep. So actually, we're taking that even a step further. So when a team member does a markup, let's say 100-day activity, and I'm a team member and I say 120 days, and you say 95, we're using those multiple points to automatically generate the 3-point estimates to go into the risk model. Yes. All right.
I'll ask you a question. This appears to me to be all about the strength of the knowledge base. Am I correct?
I think it's twofold. I think it's leveraging knowledge in a knowledge library, but I think equally importantly, it's providing a vehicle for your team members to have a say and get consensus. So I think it's 50% storage and reuse of knowledge, and I think it's 50% team member markup.
Right. Okay. I don't know if this is correct. My voice is.
I can hear you okay.
Surely there's got to be too many variables to make this viable. Pipeline isn't my subject.
Yep.
But if you had, say, an 1800 millimeter diameter pipe for stainless steel, welded joints in a bedrock situation where the partial sand, the water table level, how are you going to find that?
Great.
Among millions of other possible variables.
Great question. So I whittled it down to construction, pipeline, and quantity. That's still a pretty granular or pretty high level. You know, like you said, you might have different diameter pipe, right? So one thing I didn't show is you can
Different types of ground.
Sure. Okay. So the knowledge attributes or the knowledge elements all carry what we call tags, and you can define tags as trickiness of rock to drill or diameter of pipe. So the more attributes you feed into the knowledge library, the more specific it can be when it goes and does its match. So, well, I don't think there's millions, but there's a large number. Yes. Yep.
Structural piling.
Yep. So I think what we're saying is, look, right now there's nothing. We're taking what I think is a pretty good step forward in helping. Have we got it to the point where it understands different types of rock and diameter of pipe and gradient of pipe going up the hill? No. Are we getting there with introducing things like tags and quantities on the deliverables? Absolutely, yes. So baby steps. The other thing is that the knowledge library gets smarter. So again, if it comes back and says 45 days, and I'm like, no, it's because the piping diameter is wrong, I can put in a reason why. And that ends up, yeah, and it'll not just adjust, it'll store the reason why that adjustment was made as well. Yeah. All right, well, thank you all very much.